speaker is Adam Bonning, also from Grove City College. And Adam will talk on inflation and military expenditures in the Roman Empire, 161 to 305 AD.
All right, so as Dr. Herbner said, papers about inflation and military expenditures in the Roman Empire. I think a lot of people will look at the title of my paper and ask, why I specifically chose this topic, why this timeline, that kind of thing. So I just want to briefly go through just the background behind my paper before I get into the subject. I took a class called historiography about 2.5 years ago here, and it's basically studied historical narratives, and it looked at pretty much exclusively about how the scholars looked at the Roman Empire, and specifically its fall. I became interested in the question, why did Rome fall? And I realized that a lot of scholars simply hadn't looked at the economic aspect of the fall of Rome. So I wanted to delve into it further. And I know that looking at the Roman economy is not going to answer the big question, why did Rome fall? If it did, I'd publish this and be a very rich man. But it simply doesn't do that, but hopefully it would shed some light on it. And I think it's definitely part of the equation as to why it fell. With that said, I just wanted to, I narrowed my scope to 161 to 305 because, there's adequate evidence both prior to this time period from 27 BC to 161 and after from 305 to 476. And there are significant military ventures, both foreign and domestic, in this time period. There are a lot of wars that they fight against the barbarians and the Persians. There are a lot of civil wars, especially later during this time period. And also the crisis of the 3rd century, which is probably one of the most important but also overlooked economic crises in ancient history, is covered during this scope. So upon researching the economy of Rome further, I wanted to show that military expenditures caused the demise of the Roman economy, and that the military was primarily paid through inflating the monetary supply, and therefore by the devaluation of currency. All right, so the next section is economic theory and how it pertained to the Roman economy. Just money is simply a commonly accepted medium of exchange within a given marketplace. In the Roman Empire, much like most developed societies, it's almost exclusively precious metals. They had a bimetallic system. The two major coins used in the Roman Empire were the silver denarius and the gold aureus. There were also a couple other smaller denominations. They were bronze coins, but they weren't used very significantly at all. And they'd just be for minor transactions. So I'm going to specifically focus on the aureus and the denarius. This system was established under Augustus in 27 BC upon the founding of the Roman Empire. The aureus originally was 8 grams of pure gold. The denarius was 3.9 grams of silver. That was 99.7% pure. And there was a 25 to 1 exchange ratio between silver and gold coins. Bimetallism occurs when the state sets an arbitrary exchange rate, and that exchange rate was fixed at 25 to 1. The problem with this is that one type of metal, due to fluctuations in the market, ends up becoming more valuable than the other one. And the government stipulations don't tend to account for market fluctuations. And in the 1st and 2nd century, it certainly didn't. The overvalued money drives out the undervalued money, as stated in Gresham's law. So that began to cause a lot of problems for the Roman Empire. Next up is inflation, which Hulsman defines as an extension of the nominal quality or quantity of any medium of exchange beyond the quantity that would have been produced on the free market. This can happen through a variety of ways. The way that the Roman Empire did it was through debasing currency. They did this by reducing the fine metal content of the coin, rather than just affixing a higher nominal value to a coin. Which would, I mean, the second one was done more by counterfeiters than by the empire itself, as far as like the smaller denominations of coins go. So why does the government inflate the monetary supply? As Joel pointed out earlier, it benefits debtors. So a lot of governments try to help themselves get out of debt through inflating the monetary supply. And the simplest way to do this until the advent of the printing press is through debasing the currency. So the state inflates to lessen debt in order to try to hide state expenditures from its citizens, and also to prevent wars from becoming unpopular in the eyes of the public. And the main reason that they did this, especially after the year 66, was there was a revolt in Judea in the year 66 due to taxation to try to fund war efforts. So essentially, that left the Roman Empire either to try to crush rebellions every time they tried to raise taxes to provide revenue, or to simply inflate the money supply. So obviously they chose the latter to try to avoid internal conflict anyways. So this type of inflation to fund the military is also shown in the United States after all the major wars in the 20th century, and also after the French Revolution. I also wanted to talk about the military expenditures. Figured I should define that. Obviously, military expenditures cover the Army, Navy, the reserve forces, weapons, and other things that are vital to the military. However, in Rome, the military built most of the infrastructure. They built roads and aqueducts, and also built public goods, such as baths and schools. So they essentially all the governmental expenditures went to either the military, while very small percentages went to the emperor's private reserve and to public works later on, such as providing education and providing healthcare. Then the structure of the Roman economy. Most interesting thing I found throughout the research for this paper was that even by modern standards, the Roman Empire was fairly well off. The per capita GDP of the Roman Empire under Augustus was estimated by a couple of Italian economists to be around $1,540. So that's pretty much on par with modern day Mongolia and about 50% better off than India is in this regard today. So I just found that particularly intriguing, kind of mind-blowing. There aren't very many records of economic activity during for the Roman Empire, but most of the knowledge of the Roman economy is derived through studying different archaeological records. And Brian Ward Perkins, in his book, The Fall of Rome, discusses particularly pottery and how archaeologists studied that to get a sense of how the standard of living was and the scope of trade routes and that kind of thing. He says in this book that the economy was sophisticated to the extent that a peasant in northern Italy, to quote him, might eat off of tableware from the area near Naples, store liquids in an amphora from North Africa, and sleep under a tiled roof. So that just goes to show that they did indeed have a high standard of living and a pretty extensive trade networks. It was primarily raised through taxation, which was very, very low at the beginning of this, around 161. It was only around 0.01 to 0.03% for property taxes. There are minor tariffs and also a 1% off tax. So the empire, was not raising much revenue through taxation. But on the other hand, as I stated earlier, the revolt due to taxation pretty much prevented them from raising taxation to a higher level so that they could fund things, kind of leaving them in a very precarious situation. So as the empire expanded, the demands for revenue became higher. So by 117 AD, the denarius had gone from 97.7% or 99.7% silver to only 85%. And then I decided to start going chronologically through major wars and major changes in economic policies. Even when there weren't major conflicts, I noticed that there were pretty much repeated invasions by the barbarians from the north and from the west. So even during relative times of peace, there was pressure on the borders of the empire. The first major war was with the Parthians from 161 to 165. In order to finance the war, Marcus Aurelius debased the denarius to 75% silver, but interestingly, he also sold most of his personal belongings to avoid debasing the currency even further. So, that's a noble action on his behalf, certainly. But because of the continuing devaluation of the currency, there was an economic depression under Commodus, who was the next emperor. He debased it to 72 or 73%. There was a growing disparity between the denarius and the aureus. The aureus had more or less stayed at 100% gold throughout this time. Commodus and his two successors were assassinated within 6 months, and it kind of brings up a chicken or an egg argument. Is political turmoil caused by the economic hardships, or vice versa? But the two seem to be definitely linked. Severus, who reigned from 193 to 211, was appointed emperor and defeated rivals during a civil war, which was extremely costly. It destroyed the most prosperous city in the western half of the empire, which was Lugdunum, which is modern-day Lyon, France. So it had significant economic ramifications. Then he had to go to war with the Parthians again for 3 years. So he increased the size of the army and also increased the pay structure, or the payment of the army. But the increase of the payment of the army was about 33%, but he did this mainly to compensate them for what they're losing due to inflation. And the denarius sunk to between 50 and 60% silver during this time period. There were signs of impending economic collapse because there were higher, since the army was bigger, they demanded more pay. There are more military expenditures. Public goods projects were done to try to combat unemployment. It's a bankrupt, absolutely bankrupt treasury, and the government gigantism couldn't be rectified through taxation for fear of revolt.